Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. On behalf of Avid Learning, I welcome you all for a captivating discussion uncovering urban legacies, tracing the Sindhi and Parsi heritage of Bombay. This series draws inspiration from Avid's multi-pluralist Mumbai series, which began in 2012, which aimed to decode the past while looking to the future and finding novel ways of engaging, interacting, and re-energizing the city we love. During that series, we presented around 50 in-person discussions around our maximum city. In our online avatar in February of 2021, we launched our new series, Urban Legacies, that looked at the Jewish diaspora in Bombay, followed by the Iranian diaspora, Portuguese, Chinese, and Armenian. Continuing strongly for 2 years, today we have something special for you. In the 6th edition of this ongoing series, we celebrate the legacies of the Sindhis and the Parsi diaspora in shaping and reshaping Bombay. We strongly believe in collaboration and are proud to present this evening with the Gateway House. And special thank you to the Mumbai Research Center and the Asiatic Society for hosting us after the grand success of our previous edition, which looked at the Armenian heritage of Bombay and Calcutta. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our panel, biographer and oral historian, Saaz Aggarwal, Assistant Professor of History, SP Jain, Institute of Management and Research, Dinyar Patel, and our moderator for the evening and an avid favorite, our constant companion on this Urban Legacies series, author, Bombay History Fellow at the Gateway House, Sifra, Lentin. For more about each of our speakers, please refer to the bios, which I hope have been handed to you or they were emailed to you earlier. We were trying to save the trees. Through this lecture demonstration, our experts, Dinyar and Sifra, will bring to you the distinct, vibrant, and prosperous heritage of these two communities to understand their legacy on the city and its surroundings. It will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Sifra. Please remember, put your phones on silent. I don't think many of us have cell phone reception here, but that's another issue. And start using them. Get social, posting, reposting. Our handle is @AvidLearning and hashtag is Learning Never Stops. Thank you very much for being here in such big numbers. Sorry, it's a little bit of a tight squeeze, but look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you. Over to you, Sifra.
Welcome, everyone, to today's 6th edition of Uncovering Urban Legacies. Today, we'll be tracing the Sindhi and the Parsi heritage of Mumbai. We can all look forward to a fascinating evening of history, memories, and culture, as both communities evoke great interest and have been, I feel, sometimes unfairly caricatured. There are stories, however, from our city's 19th century riot-torn past of how Parsi men shielded their heads by wearing upturned cooking vessels as helmets. These kind of stories cannot help but bring a smile to one's face because of the kind of out-of-box thinking that one associates with the Parsi community. These are stories all Bombay Parsi families talk about, and I heard this for the first time from my mother-in-law, who's a direct descendant of the first Parsi, Dorabji Nanabai, to settle on Bombay Island as early as 1640, during the time of the Portuguese. Now, the reason I bring up Dorabji's story is actually that he was a trader from a town called Swali. Swali is downriver from Surat, and he learned to speak Portuguese with the sole aim of becoming the agent of the Portuguese in Bombay. Dorabji, after the East India Company rented Bombay Islands, then became an agent for the English. So how did the surname Patel with a double L, and you can see the spelling of Patel with a double L, was actually adopted by this family or came into this family? Now, it's important to realize that Dorabji's middle son, Rustamji Dorabji, became the first Patel or chief of Bombay Islands. Now, the cover of this book that I'm showing you is actually a biography of the first Patels of Bombay. It is an invaluable record of ancestry and family history. My mother-in-law today is the 9th generation of this Bombay family. Now, within the Patel family, Rustamji was referred to as Rustamji General. It had to be French and not general as in English. But anyway, Rustamji General was a man who actually, with the help of a Koli militia, warded off a Sindhi attack on Bombay as early as 1692 because the English governor, John Child, and other merchants were down or laid low with cholera. The story gets even more interesting here because Rustamji is now given the title by the governor of Bombay is now given the title of governor or anointed as governor of Bombay by the Kolis, temporarily in place of Child, thereby empowering him to act as chief and lead this local militia against the Siddhis, whose attack they warded off successfully. For his bravery, he was given the hereditary title Chief or Patel of Bombay, which continues to this day in this family. As a matter of interest for those who are interested in Bombay history, I also want to add that Kavachi Patel, after whom Kavachi Patel Street and CP Tank is named, was one of Rustam General's sons. Now, the Patels of Bombay were followed by other important Parsi families like the Banajis, the Wadias, the Kama, the Jiji Boys, the Tatars, but they arrived after the islands came under English rule. What is noteworthy is that the Parsis, like Dorabji Nanabai, were already traders, Ordubashis, and native brokers with the European companies in Surat and across the West Coast before they shifted to Bombay. We are always under the impression that they made their fortune in Bombay, which is not really the case. They had their foundations along the coast of Gujarat, along the port cities of Gujarat. Bombay can broadly be credited with the Parsis becoming global merchants. Colonial maritime trading networks were built on already existing Indian Ocean networks. And in order to mitigate the risk and high capital requirements of this trade, it was by necessity collaborative in nature. Parsi merchants partnered with other native merchants or foreign merchants to carry out the overseas trade of Bombay. Foreign trade of the Parsis began in a big way with the China trade as early as 1756. And as we know, and what Dinyar is going to talk about today, or at least touch upon in passing, is how these families made a big fortune in this trade. It was, as some scholars say, the capital that built Bombay. Now, Dinyar will be telling us more about why Bombay is so central, not just to the economic success of this community, but was a place where reforms within the community were initiated, where nationalist ideas took place, and where Parsi philanthropy thrived. Not to mention, we'll be touching on Parsi theatre, involvement in newspapers and printing, and the cosmopolitan culture that Parsi so naturally imbibed and contributed to. In contrast, the Sindhi heritage of Bombay is relatively new, as most of the community immigrated here during and after partition, when the province of Sindh became part of Pakistan. What is interesting to me about the Sindhi migration to Bombay is that the Hindu Sindhis already possessed a transnational Bhaiband or Sindhvarki global network before their immigration to the city, whilst the older Parsi community, in contrast, built their overseas trade after they settled in Bombay. This Bhaiband network, or Sindhvarki network, as we call it, was preceded by an older Multani and then a Shikarpuri traders network, which was involved in the caravan trade, whose trunk routes centered on Central Asia. Now, I've circled that here. And the Shikarpuri bankers were the ones who we popularly associate with the hundi, or a bill of exchange, in different manifestations. You have different kind of hundis, and although this bill of exchange or financial tool may have existed before this network actually came into being. The vibrant network has to be kept in mind, it has to be kept in mind, after partition, absorbed many of the Sindhi refugees from the camps like Ulhasnagar and Pune and elsewhere, and for the first time, women and families who were traditionally left behind in Sindh were taken overseas. It must be noted that many of these Sindhwarkis were also stranded overseas in turn after India was partitioned and could never return home to Sindh. Bombay is critical to the history of Sindhi refugees, largely because they use Karachi-Bombay sea route, some getting off en route, but most arrived in this city to rebuild their lives or to immigrate outwards overseas. This is a community that lost its properties and homeland Sindh and were often robbed of the belongings they carried on them whilst traveling to India. However, they never looked back, in spite of the hardship they faced, but always looked to a better future, which they believed was possible only or close to India's financial center, Bombay. Saaz will be talking about this community in great detail, and I hope the audience, because I could see a lot of Sindhis in the audience today, will ask a lot of interesting questions. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank AVID, the Asiatic Society, and Gateway House for sponsoring this event and inviting both Saaz and myself here. I've been asked to give a brief overview of about 20 minutes on the Parsi community. Now, that obviously is a rather difficult thing to do. I mean, books have been written, multiple volumes have been written on the history of the community, but what I want to do is give you an overview roughly centered around two different themes. And I'm going to time myself at 20 minutes since I've learned from my students the importance of keeping on time. The two themes are these that I'd like to talk about. First of all, the Parsis were instrumental in forging a lot of the global international links that Bombay developed, really from the 1700s onward, and I'll be talking about a lot of those links. The second theme that I want to talk about, which those of you who are Parsi can probably relate to, is Parsis love to fight with each other a lot. We are very, very good at fighting with one another. All you have to do is pick up a copy of a local Parsi paper or a magazine to know that we tend to be a garrulous group. And that ability to fight and argue, I would argue at least, really has been both a blessing and a curse for the community. It's been a blessing in the sense that it is, to a large degree, a reason for why this community has been quite dynamic. It's very hard in any moment of history to talk about a particular Parsi interest, because chances are if you have one Parsi supporting a particular political or economic endeavor, there'll be a few others in opposition. So it's been very hard to kind of identify a block, a community interest throughout history. So this has been a blessing in the sense that the community has been home to lively debate, which has contributed to the nation at large. It's also been a curse in a sense that I think you can trace a lot of the decline of the community to this rampant infighting. And as the community has shrunk in size, the acrimoniousness of the community, I think, in many ways has increased. But we won't go there for now. We'll stick to some themes of history. So I want first to begin with the history of the community before Bombay. Now, we don't know exactly when the Parsi community really forms in India. A lot of people throw out dates, 936 AD or the 740s. We have no concrete evidence for any of these dates. People, again, true to the theme I talked to you about Parsis arguing and fighting with one another, people fought tremendously about the idea of when Parsis arrived to India 100 years beforehand. But we have no real solid evidence. But what we do know is that approximately between, say, the 10th and, the 8th and the 10th centuries AD, this community coalesced in Gujarat. The most famous account of the community's migration to Gujarat is in a text called the Qisse-e-Sanjan, which was written in Persian by a Navsari Dastur in the year 1599, so several hundred years after the event that it was purporting to describe. And it talks about a migration from Iran due to religious persecution in Iran and a movement of people by sea going from Hormuz, in the Straits of Hormuz in Iran, to Diu and then to Sanjan, and then the dispersal of the community to various different settlements throughout the western coast of Gujarat. Now, what we do know is that That narrative is true to a degree, in the sense that, yes, you did have communities being set up on the seaboard of Gujarat. It also suggests that the community was relatively quiescent. And many people believe that the community was mostly agricultural until it started to really gain a lot of wealth during the Mughal era in places like Surat. That narrative is probably incorrect. In the sense that, we know that, the places where Parsis settled were by and large major mercantile centers. So Sanjan is a good example. I mean, Sanjan today is a tiny, small little settlement, but archaeological evidence has shown that Sanjan might actually have been, at one point in time, a relatively, advanced port, which had trading relations with places like the Middle East and China. And the places where Parsis settled, places like Bharuch or Khambat or eventually Surat, these were the Bombays of those times, right? I mean, Khambat was a major global center, and so was Bharuch at one point in time. And an interesting piece of evidence that shows us that there was a link between trade and the migration of Zoroastrians to India comes not from Gujarat, but actually from Kerala. The oldest written evidence that we have of Zoroastrians in peninsular India is from Kollam in Kerala, not from Gujarat, from Kerala. This particular copper plate that you see over here, which is basically a deed of contract, I believe, for property signed between, I think, Muslims, Hindus, Zoroastrians, and Christians. So that, I'm now talking about a Malu Parsi settlement having existed, but that shows you at least that Parsis were going to places where trade was happening. And therefore, people like me tend to think that the reason why the Parsi settlement grew in places like Gujarat is because people probably migrated to places where there already were Zoroastrian traders from times immemorial, and you get the development of something like the Parsi community out of this particular movement. So I'll be talking mostly about two things: commerce and industry, and what Parsis did with economic matters, as well as political matters. So we'll start off with commerce and industry. So Parsis had established themselves as important dubashes, or middlemen, in the port of Surat, especially with the English and the Dutch. And they oftentimes, again, were in fierce rivalry with other merchant communities, especially the Hindu Bania community, to compete for patronage from companies like the East India Company. We know that the first Parsis, as Sifra had mentioned, came to Bombay in the mid-1600s to work with the Portuguese and eventually with the English as well. And there was the steady movement of merchants from places like Surat to Bombay from the early 1700s onwards, as security situations in places like Surat dwindled due to the decline of Mughal power, raids by the Marathas, and such. And some scholars, furthermore, have suggested that the Parsi migration to Bombay was, to a degree, because they were being outcompeted by other groups. Again, the community is rather small in size, right? So going to Bombay was a way for them to kind of find a fresh field for doing business. And that, to a large degree, probably explains why so many Parsis settled in Bombay from the 1700s onward. So what precisely did Parsis do in Bombay in these early years? Well, a large number of them were involved in shipbuilding. We know that Parsis, especially one family, the Wadia family, was involved in shipbuilding in Surat. And around the year 1736, the first Wadia shipbuilder comes to Bombay and settles down. And that particular individual, Lauji Nasarwanji Wadia, built some 34 ships in Bombay, in the Bombay dockyards, and eventually the family moves to the Mazgaon dockyards as well. And they established a very long history of this family's involvement in building ships for commerce, but also for the British Navy as well. So some of the famous ships that were built by this family included the HMS Trincomalee, which you see on the screen over here. This ship still survives. It's in a port it's kept in a port in England as a living museum, and it's one of the few ships of this era to still survive. There was another famous ship that the Wadias built, which was called the HMS Cornwallis. It was built in the year 1800 by Jamshedji Bamanji Wadia. And this ship was interesting in the sense that Wadia actually carved on the kelson of the ship, part of the ship's wooden skeleton, if you will, these following words: "This ship was built by a damned blackfellow in the year 1800 AD." Which indicates that there was a degree of racial animosity between these Parsis who were building these ships and their British customers. I mean, oftentimes we tend to think of the Parsis as people who love to, bow down to the Queen and whatnot. No, the story is much more complex than that. And, for every Parsi who likes to say the community is loyal, I'll point to you 2 or 3 Parsis who are very disloyal towards the British as well. So The Parsis were involved in the shipbuilding endeavor, and families like the Wadias, who had this history in shipbuilding, eventually also start to diversify into different realms and different activities. So Ardashir Karshiji Wadia was part of a generation of the first Indians to go abroad and study abroad, things like engineering. He and his two cousins studied in London in the late 1830s and 1840s, and they wrote about their travels, and it's quite interesting to read. I mean, one of his cousins wrote about how they really liked raspberries in Great Britain in the 1840s, and that was a topic of interest for them. But people like Wadia didn't just explore places like Great Britain, they went to places like Egypt, and eventually they went to the United States as well in the year 1851, where Americans greeted him by saying, do you speak English? And he, as an American recorded, spoke better English than they did. So what else? What other activities were Parsis involved in? I mean, one of the more interesting or unique and rather odd activities was the ice business. As some of you may know, in the early 1800s, Bombay did not produce its own ice. Back then, like now, it was extremely hot. People would want some sort of refreshment to cool them down. And so ice was taken from frozen ponds, especially in New England. And for those of you familiar with Bombay, places like Spy Pond or Walden Pond were places where this ice was harvested. They were put on boats and transported to places like Bombay and Calcutta, where they were stored in ice houses, such as one that existed where the K.R. Kama Institute is now standing, just a short distance from here. About half of the cargo would survive, which is quite remarkable in this era. But the ice trade was emblematic of a broader trade that was developing between the United States and Bombay, which involved a lot of Parsis. So we know that Parsis were involved in the ice trade, and they were also involved in popularizing ice as a type of cuisine or something to go with your drink or your food. So apparently the first instance where ice cream was served in Bombay was at a party held by Jamshid Jijiboy, and everyone fell sick afterwards, since, of course, back then, as in now, we have problems with storing our ice properly. But the ice trade built a wider nexus of trade between America and India. So American apples were taken along with the ice trade to Bombay. And people like Jinsha Vacha, the famous Congress leader who would have spoken in this hall about 100 years ago or so, loved American apples. He actually talks about it in his autobiography. And in 1865, there might have been a near riot in the ice house, close by to where K.R. Kama is today, from people who wanted to buy apples. American-grown apples were so popular in this particular era. There were other items of trade that cemented Bombay-America trade at this point. So Parsis would produce blackwood furniture that would be transported to North America. Olive oil would be transported from missions in California to Bombay, and so people were having California-produced olive oil in Bombay in the early 1800s. And we know that there were strong cultural relations that were built up between Parsis and visiting American merchants. We know of at least one merchant, an American merchant, a man called George White, who actually adopted a Parsi middle name for himself. This man came from Salem, Massachusetts, and he went by George Mirwanji White amongst his friends in Bombay. So this all hints at a very complex history of relations. And for those of you who are interested more in this dynamic, there's a great book by Jenny Rose who talks about this relationship between Yankees and Parsis in the early 1800s. Now, of course, the other big trade that Parsis were involved in was opium. And this is something that most Parsis do not like to talk about, but it's something that is nevertheless instrumental in understanding how Parsi wealth is generated. Amar Farooqi, a professor at the University of Delhi who just recently retired, said in many ways Bombay in its sense has its genesis in the poppy fields of Bihar. And those of us who study the history of Bombay know that that's largely true. I mean, if you look at the history of wealth being generated in Bombay in the first half of the 19th century, much of it is coming from opium. I mean, the addiction of the nation of China, resulted in handsome rewards over here in Bombay. And the Parsis were, of course, only one of several communities involved. I mean, we had Gujarati Banyas, Konkani Muslims, Marwaris, and Baghdadi Jews involved in this trade as well. But Parsis had a very large portion of this trade. So of the 120 Bombay firms dealing in opium between the years 1803 and 1830, 49 of them were Parsi. And again, remember, we're a tiny minority. We don't have many people. The opium trade was also built upon stints of travel abroad in places like Canton, where there were foreign factories, and factories are not factories as we imagine them today. They were basically trading houses. And Parsis would join people over there from Britain, Sweden, America, in order to kind of sell opium to Chinese merchants who would then smuggle it into the country for consumption. There still are modern-day legacies of this trade in the sense that if you go to a place like Guangzhou or Macau today, you will see Parsi graveyards. They still exist, and several Chinese scholars have documented these particular cemeteries. Now, I talked to you about how Parsis like to fight and argue with each other. Just as Parsis were developing a great amount of wealth from the opium trade, there were many Parsis who were staunchly against the opium trade as well. And many of them knew one another and, dealt with one another on a daily basis. So Jamshedji Jijiboy was an early patron of Dadabhai Naoroji, but Dadabhai Naoroji over time became one of the strongest voices opposing the opium trade, not just in India, but also in Great Britain as well. By the 1850s, Parsi wealth is being increasingly deployed into textile mills. The Parsis had a long-standing history in trade of raw cotton from places like Berar in Gujarat, but increasingly you see the capital that the Parsis had developed from the opium trade being deployed into creating the new textile mills. So it's no mistake that a lot of the wealthy opium families tend to become pioneers in the cotton industry as well. In 1854, a Parsi, Kavasji Nanabai Davar, becomes the first Indian to establish a successful textile mill in India. And this individual, of course, sets a much longer train of events where the Vadias, the Tatas, and the Pitits get involved in the cotton textile trade as well. Parsis were also involved in sending the machinery from Great Britain to be worked at these textile mills. So, the first textile mill machinery that was sent to Ranchatulal Chotalal in Ahmedabad was sent by Dadabhai Naoroji from Great Britain to Ahmedabad. It unfortunately sank off the coast of South Africa, but that's another story. Civic activism and politics. So, from the 1840s onward, there's a definite overlap between Parsis' internal politics and the emerging politics of the city of Bombay and eventually nationalist politics as well. You start to have a major generational kind of divide between an older generation of what were known as Shetiyas, these mercantile elite, and a new generation of educated young individuals, people who were educated at Elphinstone College, and Elphinston's first classes were again held in this very building, so it's kind of appropriate that we're here. And the newspaper Ras Guftar in many ways symbolizes this divide that was taking place. This was a reformist newspaper that was set up by Dadabhai Naoroji, again a representative of this new reformist creed within the Parsi community, which demanded changes to things like the Parsi Panchayat, which was as corrupt back then as it is right now. Now, the Ras Guftar was in opposition to the old vested interests, but they were also funded by some of the old vested interests as well. I mean, the principal benefactor of this newspaper was a man called Kashiji Nasarwanji Kama, whose family got his money from the opium trade, which of course Naoroji opposed, but which nevertheless funded this effort at reform. So the relationships are very complex over here. People like Naoroji and others like Naoroji Fardunji were members of a generation called Young Bombay, and these were a reformist group not just of Parsis, but of others educated in places like Elphinstone, Gujaratis, Konkani Muslims, Maharashtrians. And even, Parsi institutions like Ras Guftar eventually diversify and take on board Gujaratis such as Karshandas Mulji to write and edit the papers. Parsis, therefore, were instrumental in forging this kind of inter-communitarian fabric that really marks and distinguishes Bombay's history from the 1840s and 1850s onward. They'd meet in places like here and start organizations like the Bombay Association, the first modern political association set up in this city, which sent petitions to Parliament, which again was the scene of major fractious debates between different Parsis and members of different communities, but nevertheless formed the very building blocks for modern politics in this part of the country. Now, of course, Parsis played an influential role in the Congress as well. If you look at this photo, you'll see many people who wear hats, like the hats I'm wearing over here, which signify them as being Parsis. But going back to the theme that I have of Parsis fighting with one another and disagreeing with one another, the Congress is a great example of this dynamic in the sense that, some of the leading figures in the Congress in this era were Parsis, people like Dadabhai Naoroji, Behramji Malbari, Dinsha Vacha, and others. And, through the Gandhian era, you have a coterie of Parsis who are very influential in the Congress. I mean, they are dominant, Parsi players in the Congress right up until the 1960s and 1970s when we somehow lose our interest in politics. But there also is a very strong reaction to the Congress amongst members of the Parsi community. So just at around the same time that there's the so-called Muslim split, where Syed Ahmad Khan leads a group of Muslims to oppose the Congress, there's also a Parsi split that's led by Dinyar Manakshi Petit, the member of this big textile mercantile firm. And he leads a lot of Parsis in a position of opposition towards the Congress that riles up many congressmen as much as it did, the opposition from people like Syed Ahmad Khan. Even amongst Congress supporters, there were great divisions. So in 1886, Dadabhai Naoroji was president of the Congress, and he declared that the goals of the Congress were to exclusively focus on political reform and not talk about social reform, things like widow remarriage or things like that. And that causes one of his closest friends and Congress supporters, a man called Bairamji Malbari, to resign from the Congress over his dislike of this particular position. So even, again, amongst Parsis who have the same political stripe, there could be these internal divisions that caused a lot of splits and divisions. And this dynamic continues all the way through the 20th century. The one thing where Parsis come the closest to kind of forming a bloc, a group interest in a political movement happens during Prohibition. We were staunchly against it. No surprise now. Yet, surprisingly, the person who puts Prohibition in place here in Bombay was a Parsi, M.D.D. Gilder. So again, even on the issue of Daru, which is sacred and holy to us in many respects, there was great division and rivalry over what precisely to do. Now, I don't have much time left, so I'm going to very quickly go through some themes of culture. And the one thing I'd like to talk about is how these various things I've talked about, economics, politics, overlap with themes of culture as well. Many of the individuals who are either, leading mercantile voices or early political leaders were involved in cultural endeavors. And again, a great example is Dadabhai Naoroji, in the sense that Naoroji was an avid cricketer. Some people, regarded him, called him the god of cricket. Even though he was still in his 60s when people were making that remark. He was also someone who was involved in early Parsi theater. He had an interest in singing, which was eventually passed down to his granddaughter. His granddaughter was a classically trained singer who actually would sing songs to Gandhi. She would take tunes from Gilbert and Sullivan and change the words to quit India instead and sing to Gandhi. But the last thing I really want to talk about, which kind of wraps up the various themes that I've been trying to present in this very short presentation, is in regards to soda. Now, many of us will associate Parsis with things like raspberry soda, and Parsis were great popularizers of soda in India. We were quick to kind of identify that soda was something that Britons liked. We popularized it amongst, Indians, who at first were kind of skeptical. We were kind of skeptical towards, what this new fizzy type of drink was. But over time, Parsis established some of the biggest soda businesses in Bombay and across India as well. By the early 1900s, there were 150 licensed soda factories in Bombay, 150, and many of them were owned by Parsis. But Parsis also went abroad, abroad in the sense of elsewhere in India, to places like Calcutta and formed soda factories there, and even to places really abroad, like Singapore. In the 1920s, there were two competing Parsi brands for soda, Faram Rose and Phoenix, which had ads in Malay and Tagalog, and not Tagalog, in Malay and Chinese, which again shows you a sense of cosmopolitanism that was embodied in this community, which is a theme which I'd like to end on. So, I mean, this community has obviously played a very large role in terms of broadening the global scope of Bombay, and wherever Parsis went, we kind of mirrored a broader movement of Bombay people, whether they were Sindhis, Gujaratis, or Muslims, and we brought a bit of Bombay to these different corners of the world, wherever we settled. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. Avid Learning, Gateway House. Thank you, Sifra, for helping me tweak my presentation. And a big thank you to all of you who braved the Bombay traffic to be here. Is that better? So I wanted to start with this. I was driving past the Taj the other day, and I saw this lovely, the icon of our city and a board with the name of a Sindhi on it. And I thought, now who's this real estate tycoon who's got his name in there? But of course, I knew who it was, and I'm just quickly telling you before I start with my presentation. I just wanted to give you a bit of a surprise so that you'll know that things are not always what they appear to be. So what I'm going to tell you about is the 19th century connection between Bombay and Sindh. what happened during the freedom movement and a special connection that happened there. And when partition took place, what happened, and a few of the gifts that the Sindhis carried to Bombay, some of which you already know about, of course. So in 1843, the British conquered Sindh, annexed Sindh illegally to their empire, and they made Sindh a part of the Bombay province, and that was the first big connection that happened. They moved the capital of the Mirs, which was Hyderabad. I can see people here who probably think of Hyderabad, Sindh as, they think of it as the place that their families came from. But the British moved the capital to Karachi and developed it into a cantonment and port, a center of trade, a center of education, and a very cosmopolitan place because a lot of the communities from Bombay, from the Bombay province, came to settle there. As a port, it was very useful to the Sindhi community because now, as members of the empire, they had access to a lot of countries around the world. And very soon, as Sifra told us when she was talking about the Sindh-Varkis, they had establishments all around the world in ports. And this started more than about 100 years before partition. And many of them had bases in Bombay. So, of course, Bombay benefited too in terms of revenue as well as opportunities. Karachi had big and very devoted kind of Maharashtrian population. This is a picture of the Parab family. Parshuram was 15 when this photo was taken, and he was 17 when partition took place. When I interviewed him, he was in his late 80s, and he still remembered Karachi so fondly. Here, of course, the Parsis were the social elite in British India, and you can recognize saris, they're wearing garas. This is the Sindhi Amil family. And Sindh remained under the Bombay University, so students had to travel to Bombay to take their examinations. And a lot of those who were educated in Sindh after partition, they contributed to developing India, in Bombay in particular, to building the new roads and the bridges and the suburban railway stations. All those engineers who built the Sakhar Barrage, at one time there were so many who worked in L&T that it was, in joke, they called it Larsani and Tubrani. And the women, it's quite interesting that even in the 1930s, families were sending their brilliant daughters to study at Lady Hardinge College in Delhi to become doctors. So at a time in the 30s and 40s when most girls of that socioeconomic class couldn't even cross the road on their own, they were studying to be doctors. And all those lady doctors, as they used to be called back then, came to Bombay and set up practice. And, you know, of course, this place has probably seen better days, but it was a time when families were moving from traditional midwives to doctors, and, you know, women doctors were much more, they were preferred. So, and of course, that was what helped in reducing the maternal mortality rates. Another big connection was in the freedom movement, and this is something which was so strong, but it's only very recently that people have realized. It was a Bombay Sindhi. The Motwani family had settled in Bombay in the 1920s, and they were doing electrical business. And of course, that was the highest technology of the time. And it was Nanik Motwani himself used to travel to these meetings and set up the sound system so that everybody could hear Gandhi instead of his voice being relayed by others. But of course, you know, it was in 1947 that the line was drawn, and in spite of all the contribution to the freedom movement, there was a lot more, which I'm not talking about because, of course, I have very little time, but the participation was absolutely across the board. Families, women, children, there were martyrs. There was a young man was killed, he was hanged. He was only 19 years old, and, you know, we've all heard of Shahid Bhagat Singh, but nobody's really heard of Hemu Kalani. So anyway, Sindh was given intact, and then the Sindhis, it was thought that the Sindh was given intact to partition, and it was assumed that the Hindus would remain in Sindh, but that wasn't possible. They had to leave. And of course, they had the whole world to go to, and many did, but because of the proximity to Bombay, and because many of them already they'd done trade or they'd been associated with Bombay, that was the major port. And the sea route was the safest. And many of these people had never left Sindh before, but they soon got used to the rain. In Sindh, most people had not even ever seen a real umbrella. You know, they might have seen it in a magazine or a movie, but it just didn't rain. And in Sindh, you could just go out and fly a kite whenever you wanted because it hardly ever rained. But when the refugees arrived in Bombay, a lot of them just stayed on at the docks because they had nowhere to go. And that became a big problem for the city of Bombay. I've read news reports about that. But the government did set up, the government had made arrangements. There were camps all over, actually in many places in the country. But Kalyan was the biggest. And here you can see a happy family. It's actually based on photographs. These are the barracks, which were later converted into blocks. Although still very congested, and you can see some wild pigs wandering around. Now, you've seen all these fabulous images that I'm showing you, the illustrations. And I wanted to just tell you that the artist is here. He's here in the audience today. Shubhadeep Mukherjee, could you just stand up so that everybody will see you? Thank you so much. He has done this really amazing job. This is my new book. It's called Losing Home, Finding Home. And what I wanted was pictures that we don't have photos of. And that's why, we worked together to do this. Here's another one. This is Kalyan Camp. And what we have here, of course, Kalyan was a district that was being developed at that time, but it was also a place where Bombay's essential work ethic was being consolidated. The lady at the window is Sushila Rao, and she was the wife of the camp commandant at that time in the early 50s, or maybe in the late 40s. And she told me that if she ever woke up before sunrise, she would look out of the window and she'd see this huge crowd of people walking to the railway station. And this is who they were. They were people who were taking things to Bombay to trade. They'd made things at home, papad and pickle. They were taking them to sell. Some of them were students going to college. And, they would study for 2 hours and morning college and then work for the rest of the day. And of course, it was a long train drive to Bombay, so they would leave at 4 in the morning and they'd come back up at midnight, just sleep for 2 hours and carry on again. I found this online. I wanted to show you this. It said 1945. It's a picture of Kalyan Station. This is one of the references that we used for that illustration. But it was definitely after partition because you can see the name Kalyan written in Sindhi. This is, of course, a traditional thing. Many of the refugees did this, and this again was, they would buy in wholesale and then sit in the retail market, and they would sell at a lower price. And when everything was gone, they would sell the sack. So the sack is this symbol, actually, of what the Sindhis did. They would sell the sack. The other thing is that because they were selling at lower margins, they weren't very popular, and this is probably one of the roots of the prejudice against the community that many people complain about. This is actually Sudhir Patwardhan, our urban landscape artist, and it's his rendering of Ulhasnagar, industrial town and toxic river and dead cow and everything. Ulhasnagar had all these people who came with nothing. There are so many rags to riches stories there. Many of those people are living today in bungalows and skyscrapers in other parts of the world. But Ulhasnagar, it's a center of industry, it's a center of education, but it's very difficult to get to because the trains are awfully crowded and the roads are so bad. They're just pitted and potholed. And the civic amenities are so bad. The drainage is poor. There's no water supply. In the late 90s, there were building collapses. People died. So many families homeless. An activist made a list of illegal buildings, more than 800. He made a plan with the municipality to fix those problems. 20 years have passed and nothing has been done. And of course, there were other areas. I mean, I've only told you about Kalyan. There was, that was the most intense. Of course, we had Chembur, we had Sion, and we also had a newly instituted Bombay Housing Board, which came up in 1948. Of course, the Bombay housing crisis was already something that was prevalent, and of course, the influx of refugees made it much more intense. So I've come across these names, Saidram Gidwani, who left his corporate job as the head of the Sarabhai Mills and came to Bombay and took up an honorary position as the head of the housing board. There was also H.B. Shivdasani, who was the deputy commissioner of the Bombay Municipal Corporation. Now, I'd like to think that it was they who made things a little easier, A, by opening up new districts, B, by making loans available to through the housing board, but I don't have any proof of this. We need researchers who go in and look for those minutes of meetings and documents which say that it might have been them. What I do know is that housing societies were a big thing even in Sindh, and here's a relic from 1928 when the Amil colony was built in Karachi. And as we all know, after partition, cooperative housing societies became a very big thing in Bombay. I've interviewed so many people who told me about relatives who came in, they took a loan, they collected money from their relatives and friends who they wanted as their neighbors, and they built a building. And once they'd done that, then they knew how to do it. So they built another building and they built another building. Some of them had experience in building in Sindh. Some of them had experience in contracting. But I've even heard of cases of people who'd not even been in business building like a dozen buildings in Bandra and, so many. This clipping from a book that I wrote called The Amils of Sindh, it tells us about R.J. Advani, who built more than 100 buildings in Bombay. And I asked the guy, this builder, whether for permission to use this in my book, and he said, of course you can. Everybody uses it, even other builders use it. So about the women, they, from economic necessity, they went to work in offices and in assembly lines. And I think they were the role models that created transformed the Bombay offices, which were previously, of course, male-dominated. But they were also those who we talked about earlier, who were making the papad at home, and it was being sold by the men. This short story is really fabulous, and this is a good book if anyone wants to know. It's from the heart, it's from the writers who experienced partition on both sides of the border. And this is Buri, who is, she walks into somebody's home and she's selling papad, and the guy recognizes her. She was, beauty in the neighborhood when he was young, and maybe he had a crush on her, whatever. But what comes across is financial independence, what that can do to you, even when you're really in bad straits and, experiencing that freedom. So that was a transformation that happened there. And of course, I don't know whether you recognize him. He's Ashok Mirchandani. He stands outside Kailash Parbat, and he sells all these goodies. What I also wanted to say is that if you cross the road to Kolaba Market, you can ask any sabjiwala for sai bhaji and sai bhaji ka saman, and they'll know what proportion to give you of spinach and what we call shepu in Maharashtra and katta bhaji. So, this is something which I realized only when I had house guests who were from Pakistan. And they said to me, why do you have so many shops with the name of our city? And that was when I realized that, we don't think of Karachi as a city. We think of it as a place that gives you samosas and, papdi chaat. And that's so strong. And there is, I think, I've got Shakuntala Bharwani here, right, who wrote a book about her beloved homeland, Sindh, even though she has never been to Sindh. And, that nostalgia and that connection to the homeland, that's been transported. Of course, we have a Bombay bakery in Hyderabad, Sindh as well. And there was a Bombay Sports there, but it's now in Dhobi Talao, as we all know. So the Sindhis also brought their places of worship from Sindh to Bombay. And this is Sadbelo, which is a really beautiful place. It's on an island in the river in Sakhar. And now we have Sadbelo in Bombay. It's different. In Sindh, most of the shrines were kind of multi-faith, people from different faiths would worship in the shrines. And I think in fact, I know that there are some gaddis of the peers still being looked after in Bombay, which the Sindhis go to, but mostly they've become a bit right-wing along with the flavor of our times. The other thing is that because Sindhis have this affinity for just absorbing good thoughts and good, religious practices from other communities, Ganpati Visarjan is done not just in Bombay, but also in Europe and in Africa and in South America, where the Sindhis, the Sindhwarkis, have their communities. The biggest contribution the Sindhis made to the city of Bombay is, of course, the educational institutes. And some of them were actually brought from Sindh. This is Professor Kundanani of National College, Hyderabad, and he actually brought his college to Bombay. He carried the books, he carried some of the laboratory equipment, and you can see him here. I interviewed Kishu Mansukhani, who is his nephew, who was a child in the same home when they had just come from Sindh. And what he's doing here, he's writing postcards to his former colleagues at National College. And he's telling them, we are all going through a difficult time. And whatever you're doing, whether you're frying pakoda, frying tikkis to make a living, or you're working in your uncle's shop, or you're giving tuitions, just keep doing it. But I'm going to call you back. You will have your job. You will get your students soon. And he did. And of course, the Hyderabad Sindh National Collegiate Board now has so many institutes which educate so many kids. But, when you look at this list, or even when you look at the brick and mortar, you don't really see the determination and the bravery of those who built them. And you don't see the rejection and the humiliation they faced and which they, they transformed them. We also have institutions which came out of the camps. This is the lady the young woman who's leaning forward, looking enthusiastic. She's Nalini Advani. She was 19 years old. And this is, the parents, this is Mulund camp. The parents were worried that the children they're not going to school. So they asked for volunteers. They got a room from the government and they started a school. The children sat on floors. Very soon, the school got going. It was recognized by the government, and they got educationists from Sindh, so it was giving a good level of education. I can't end without talking about the social life of the Sindhis, and whether it's the radio club or the CCI, or whether it's Kar Gymkhana, that's one thing. There are also hotels, and I think we have someone here who in the 1970s brought Holiday Inn Juhu to the first franchise in India, and also India's first, a lot of firsts, including these two. We also have, you'll be surprised to hear that Bombay sailing was largely sponsored by a Sindhi, sailing and bridge tournaments. And I'm going to end with this this little bit about the Hindi film industry. I just want to give you this sense of the complexity of the whole partition experience of the Sindhis. It's like, you're walking down the road and a flower pot falls on your head. And then you just say, okay, fine, I don't know what happened, but I have to keep going, so you keep going. And along the way, sometimes, odd things happen, okay? So here we have so many actors, so many producers, but what about the caricatures that the film industry propagated that just kept reinforcing the stereotypes of Sindhis? And look at the big producers who made the biggest productions on partition, which are Bunyad and Tamas. Both of them were Sindhi, but these are Punjabi stories. And of course, the Sindhwarkis they were distributing the films all around the world. Why are the Hindi films so popular in Russia and Thailand? And, why do people in Dubai speaking Hindi so well? So that's about the Sindhis and Bombay. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Dinyar, and thanks, Saaz. Fantastic presentation. And we saw two different angles, Dinyar with economics, business, and of course the argumentative Parsi, if I could say that, and politics. And Saaz with all the Sindhi culture that has become so much a part of our city. Now, actually, I just want to dive straight in because I want the audience actually to participate a lot more. But I'm just going to get the ball rolling. And Dinyar, I wanted to actually ask, I mean, both of us make the point that, Parsis were involved as traders and the Bashis before they came to Bombay. But why is it that when we talk about Parsi history, is it because of the colonial narrative that their success is actually associated largely with the European companies? And the fact that a lot of Parsis looked up to the Queen and the British royal family, but Parsis and the English always go together, and they said, like 19th century Bombay, early 20th century Bombay, it was more about, they were good for each other. Is that true?
Thank you. That's a great question. And, to a large degree it is true. I mean, in the sense that Parsis did get very rich through the British connection. Not entirely, but to a very large degree. I mean, a counter-narrative to that is that Parsis also were very influential and were quite wealthy individuals in native states, where the dynamic was, of course, a bit more confrontational in some places, like Baroda against British rule. But we cannot deny the fact that yes, there was a very strong connection between British rule and the Parsis. Perhaps it was represented more than what it actually was, in the sense that, in this era, if you were a wealthy Indian, you had to have good relations with the British. If you didn't, you weren't wealthy anymore, right? I mean, just ask anyone who went through 1857 on the losing side, and they would have told you that. Across the board, there is a degree of at least on the surface, pro-British sentiment. If you look at leading Maharashtrians or Gujaratis in a place like Bombay, there would have to be. But the thing I find quite interesting is distinguishing between the public rhetoric and what private sentiment could be. And oftentimes there could be a difference. You might not say, well, Queen Victoria, whatever. But you could at least lay seeds of doubt in British rule. And at least from having studied someone like Dadabhai Naoroji, I can tell you that the rhetoric between what was expressed publicly and what was expressed in private could oftentimes be quite different. I mean, Naoroji did not go to the extent of saying, get rid of the king or the queen or whatever, but he did, he was friends with people who called Queen Victoria the Queen of Black Death and Famine. He'd share stage with, leading socialists like Henry Hinman are not contradictory. And if you read the private writings of Parsis to one another, they're as interested in things like self-government or rights as any other Indian was in this era. In the 19th century, it was beneficial to play up that projection. And Parsis understood this. I mean, a lot of the narrative that Parsis was somehow, the colonial elite or, had become the colonial elite due to the connection with the British is a direct result of what happened in 1857. The first English language books talking about the history of the Parsi community as a product of this successful interaction with Britons are published right after 1857 to kind of, say that, look, we're not the guys who rebelled. But it's not like the entire community felt that way. But it is undeniable that a large degree of Parsi success did come from colonial interaction.
Thanks, Dinyar. Saaz, I just wanted to know about Sindhi activism when Sindh was under British rule. Activism, any kind of civic or political, was that existing? And in Bombay, what was the situation with the community? There was a settlement of Sindhis in Bombay before partition also.
So I can tell you a little bit about the freedom movement. I touched on it very lightly in my talk, but it was really a big thing. I mean, right from the first Indian National Congress, the picture which Dinyar showed, I think if you zoom in, you'll find a Sindhi there. I can't remember the name, but Sindhis were very committed, and it was across the board, men, women, and children. I'll give you an example of a Sindhi family in my city, which is Pune, and
ran a bookstore. And it was called, I can't remember the name, modern bookstore or something like that. But their main customers were the soldiers because it was in the cantonment. And when Gandhi wrote his book, Quit India, they plastered all their display cases with that book. So when the communists came in, what would they see? Quit India, quit India, quit India. And young Vishnu, he was probably about 20 or 21, and he wrote this very impassioned plea to the British. I don't remember, what it was called, but it was that, you should understand what it feels like to be a slave in your own country kind of story. And for that, he was going to jail, because that was considered an incendiary. There's a word for it, I forget what it's called, but invoking sedition, that's it. So that was sedition. He was put in jail, and then later his father was also jailed. And at that time, it's funny because, we talked about this being part on the side of the crown and against it. The prisoner was an Aggarwal, he was later the Inspector General. But there was a lot of activism. There was Hemu Kalani, the person I was telling you about, he was captured. There was a British troop train coming, so they took out a raid or something like that, and then an alert was raised, and he was the only one who was caught, and he was sentenced to be hanged. And obviously the people petitioned the Viceroy for mercy, and there was an edict that yes, he will be released, and he gives the names of the co-conspirators, and he never did, and he walked to the gallows, and he was 19 years old. So, you asked an additional thing about in Mumbai, and I gave you the example of the Motwani family who were very involved. But what I also wanted to tell you is that Sindh was the only place in India that was actually under martial law during the freedom movement, which I think tells its own story.
Thanks, Saaz. Dinyar, I'm going to really touch a bit on your book because the subtitle of your book, Navroji, the subtitle is Pioneer of Indian Nationalism. What is Navroji and his collaborators' most important contribution to India's freedom movement, and what role did the city play in forming these ideas about financial, not just financial drain, but you've talked about moral drain?
So I think the greatest contribution Navroji made to the freedom movement was again that idea of a drain, an economic component to an economic rationale for getting some sense of either political reform or eventually self-rule from the British, in the sense that for perhaps since perhaps the 1770s or so, there had been an observation of something like a drain of wealth going on in India. I mean, made by Britons as well as Indians, but Navroji really formalized that narrative by taking statistics and conducting economic scholarship that debunked the idea that the British were actually making India a very prosperous place. I mean, one thing we have to remember, I mean, it might sound a little counterintuitive to us today, but colonialism was justified not just by Britons but by Indian supporters as well as something that was making India richer and more prosperous. And Navroji was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first to really, out there in public, not to say that that was completely wrong and false, but to show the evidence that that was wrong. And as I've discussed in my book, the foundations of Navroji's idea of self-government, the need for self-government, came from the drain. The drain was the justification, getting rid of the drain of wealth was the justification for self-government. The idea that India was getting poorer and poorer and poorer every year due to British rule was in many ways a polemical argument as well as an economic argument, in the sense that Navroji kind of set up a situation where he said, look, we can get rid of the drain by employing more and more Indians, and that idea of war during his political career to say, well, maybe 50% of Indians will be staffed in the government, or maybe 70%, maybe 80, maybe 95, why don't we talk about something like self-government instead? So you see a very logical progression throughout his political career, kind of from an economic argument of India was getting poorer every year, and the famines that were taking place in the 18th century were the result of British rule, to this idea that the only way to stop this devastating cycle was to get self-government, or Swaraj, as he said in 1906. Now, as to the question of what Bombay had to do with it, the British historian C.A. Bailey gave this term about the type of politics that were taking place in this part of the country as being something called statistical liberalism, in the sense that Nauroji was one of several individuals from Western India to really have detailed statistical analysis of why things were so bad in India. Ranade is perhaps the best exponent of this particular strain of thought, but there are many others. I mean, people like G.V. Joshi, someone who probably many of you have never heard of, but who was very influential on both Gokhale as well as Tilak as well. And people in Western India, as distinct from, say, people in, say, what was called Madras or Bengal at the time, really focused a lot on the ideas of economics to justify the need for political reform. And it's no mistake why they focused on economics. Bombay was, of course, always a mercantile city. All of these nationalist individuals were also involved in the realm of business. Nauroji was a businessman. Ranade helped set up businesses in Pune. People like Feroz Shah Mehta were not businessmen, but they were from mercantile families and, they were lawyers. So they were defending or prosecuting businessmen all the time. So the mercantile spirit of Bombay really animated this focus on economics. And we see this come out in Nauroji's career in the sense that, Nauroji first kind of delivers his enunciation of a drain of wealth in the year 1867. And that's significant in the sense that what had happened just right before? Well, there was a famine in Orissa. The famine killed perhaps 1 out of every 3 people in Orissa. I mean, this unfortunately was the norm in this era. So that got me thinking again about what economic situations were like in India that caused this terrible devastation. And closer to home, after the end of the American Civil War, which caused a great degree of profits for Indian cotton magnates. Many Indian cotton magnates, Indian cotton businesses go bust, including Nauroji's business, which kind of was a moment of realization that Bombay was so closely tied into global economics. There was limited autonomy for what could happen to your business fortunes. I mean, you rode on the rises and falls of what was going on in New York or Manchester or London, and there was not much you could really do as a colonial subject. So things like that, I think, really got people like Nauroji thinking, we're not just politically colonized, we're economically colonized as well. And so let's use economics to our advantage as well, to campaign for something like political rights.
I actually want to touch a bit upon the issue of the refugees here when they arrived. I mean, most Sindhi refugees came here to Mumbai expecting, like, it was the financial capital of India. They had a greater chance of survival here and success. But it wasn't all a bed of roses. Can you just give us some example of what they went through before things really started settling down?
So first of all, I should start by saying that when they left, it was they were fleeing for their lives, and they thought that when they arrived in the new truncated India, their problems would be over. And it was really a shock that their problems had just become worse in a way. So there were different categories. I would say there were some who already had some kind of base. They had a family, or they, like in the case of my grandfather, he already had been offered a job by somebody in Bombay. So he knew he and his family would be, at least, they would survive. So there was that lot, and for that I think we should be grateful to the Sindhis who were in Bombay, or the Sindhis who were well off and they had bases in Bombay, because they completely went overboard to help the displaced community. They just opened their doors and they just gave and gave. They put their own comfort aside, and there were, you'd hear of rooms full of, the rooms were just white at night because the floor was full of people sleeping at night, and 40 people sharing one bathroom kind of stories, even the ones who were quite well off. Then you come to the camps where the situation was very, it was unsanitary. I interviewed this elderly Parsi gentleman who remembers when he was in, who never forgot. He was in school, in a boarding school in Nasik, and he and 3 of the other boys who had good handwriting were sent to the Devlani camp. Swali camp. There were 4 of them. They must have been 15, 16 years old. And they didn't know anything about what a refugee was. They didn't know what sin was. They'd heard there was somebody called Gandhi and somebody called Nehru. They landed at this camp. And they're given registers in which to write the names of these people who are coming in. And he remembered the trains full of people coming in, sitting on the roofs, everybody's wearing white. Now, why are they wearing white? It's only because that was the cheapest fabric, right? You had these bales of fabric. And they were taught a few words, a few sentences of Sindhi, and he was in his late 80s and he still said that to me, Tunjo nalo chai, Tunjo pijo nalo chai, Tunjo hadu nalo chai. What's your name, what's your father's name, what's your mother's name, what's your grandmother's name, and stuff like that. They had to write everything down, they were registering people. But his description of the camp, he said, you know, it was so filthy. He said we got sick, we couldn't eat, and there were the rice stank. And also, the other interesting thing was that these boys were given an Alsatian dog, you know, to walk around, I suppose, to help them in their duties in some way. But you know, you think about where did that dog metaphor come from? It must have come from the concentration camps, right, where you didn't want your prisoners to run away or something like that. So things were not that good, and that's probably why people who are able-bodied, who are doing whatever they could to get out of it as soon as possible. Another story I heard was, you know, I told you about these people sitting in the Bombay docks. It's because they didn't want to be found out to remote places where they would have to do things that they never. They were really urban people, so they couldn't sort of take up farming. They couldn't go and live in a small place. They wanted to be where they could just get back to life the way they knew it. But the person who one of the people who I interviewed, he was a child, must be about 11 years old, and his family arrived by ship, and they were herded into. I don't know how they were taken to. VT, CST now, and they were made to camp there for 2 days, and there were special trains. Special trains had been arranged to take the refugees to places they didn't know where they were going. They just herded into a train, and the train set off in Delhi. And they landed up in Andhra Pradesh. He grew up in Vijayawada, and then he joined the army, and I suppose happily ever after happened there. But you know, people went through a lot before things settled down.
Thanks, Saaz. I wanted to talk about civic philanthropy. I mean, most of the institutions in Bombay, at least 19th, early half of the 20th century, have a Parsi donor. What really motivated such a small community to donate so quickly to our city?
So there is a longer history of charity within the Parsi community and the Zoroastrian religion in general. I mean, you can go back to Greek sources to see how ideas of charity, or at least community service, were imbricated within Zoroastrian and Iranian society as well. With our even in our own religious customs, I mean, in our funeral customs, when Utamno takes place, the equivalent of a funeral, traditionally that was a moment where philanthropic donations were announced or made. So, I mean, philanthropy is a very important component of Zoroastrianism, and this longer history of philanthropy can be traced back to the Parsi community before it comes to Bombay as well. I mean, various philanthropic efforts were put on display for building religious structures or things like natmas in places like Surat or Bharuch and elsewhere. Once you come to Bombay, there are a few reasons for why Parsis get so closely involved in philanthropic efforts. I mean, one reason is purely economical. We were rich in comparison with many other communities. There's no question about it. I mean, we had a lot more capital than many other communities, and for various reasons, was an expectation that wealth should be given back to the community at large. Whether it was justified religiously or on grounds of solidifying good relationships with other communities. Another reason for why Parsis were so involved in philanthropy was that it was good politics. In the sense that the British government did encourage active philanthropic engagement, not because they were being beneficial or altruistic, but because the British, by and large, ran governments in India on the cheap. The British would talk about the need to spread education in India, but they gave very little funding for education. And so Indians were supposed to step up to the plate and provide that funding. And a lot of Indians did, whether they were Parsi or Gujarati or Maharashtrian, for efforts like education from the 1840s and 1850s. It's not just Parsis who are philanthropic. I mean, there are many, many other stories of, I mean, Jagannath said is a great example of someone who donates so much money and so much infrastructure to the city, and of course, not a Parsi. And there were others also. Mangaldas was donating to the educational infrastructure of this country. Ahmedabad as well as here in Bombay. But since there were so many wealthy Parsi Chetias, they were expected to be part of this process. And by giving money back, by helping build institutions, they received rewards. I mean, they would receive maybe a fancy, a title, or those funny letters that you see at the end of people's names from the 19th century, or they would be appointed to a legislative body or to a civic body. So there were altruistic methods, but there also were methods of self-interest that explain this as well. Parsis, of course, did donate across the board to different communities, but a lot of that work was also meant for internal community use as well. By building bridges and tanks in Bombay, you weren't just helping the community at large, you were helping the community as well, because people lived in these areas. And so, there was a degree of self-interest built in this philanthropy as well.
Thanks, Dinyar. I wanted to ask Saaz, was it the same kind of trajectory that the Sindhis followed in the 1960s, 70s, 80s in Mumbai?
This is about philanthropy. I think I just want to check with the audience. Do you see the Sindhis as a community that does philanthropy?
Absolutely.
Right. So there is a lot of philanthropy coming out of from the Sindhis, and like you said, it's a component of Zoroastrianism, but it's not a component of Hinduism actually. I think that it might have, this is just conjecture again, I'm not sure if I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but it could possibly be because the Hindus were a minority in an Islamic country and in an Islamic region, and it was definitely a part of the Islamic religion. And it's a part of every Sindhi. As far as I know, every Sindhi wants to give. I'm not even a Sindhi, but I put aside some of my, I'm just a fake Sindhi. I put aside some of my income to give away. And my mom used to do it. And, everyone I know, and the Sindhi companies were doing long before the government made it mandatory. They were, they had foundations. And one of the things I've found is that sometimes they give and they don't want anyone to know they're giving. And what I've been told is, it comes to me, I don't know where it's come from, and it's just going through me. Which I think is such a lovely way to look at it. You're not doing it to, everybody doesn't do that. There are enough people who want their name on the board. But I kind of like the other way of doing it. I kind of appreciate that a lot. In terms of the 60s, 70s and 80s, I'm not sure, but I think that they were giving, what they had along the way, and I'm not really sure, I haven't really looked that much, I can't answer that specifically, but I do know that it's a thing with the community, everybody gives, and companies give, yeah.
Actually, what I meant to say was like what Dinyar said, that they were giving for their community, but it also sort of benefited the larger society.
So I can give you the example of the Sindhi educational institutions in Bombay. So when they built them, they were, I should tell you this also, when I wrote about it once for a news portal, they asked me to write something about Sindhis. So I mentioned this, and then the sub-editor changed what I'd written. And luckily I saw it before it went online. And the person said, education was a sector that the Sindhis got into. And that really upset me so much, because education was not a sector that the Sindhis got into, It was not a sector. They were not thinking of sectors. They were doing something that they needed to do. They wanted their children to get educated. Education was very important for them. They wanted their teachers to get their jobs back. That was very important to them at that time. But they were not thinking about, so in National College, for example, the first enrollment was a Muslim, and his name was Shakir Gaya. And of course the board was like, they just threw us out, do we really want this guy? And Kundalani said, yes, why we call it National College? This is National College. And apparently, I don't know Shakir Gaya, but it's on the National College website that he and Kuldani, obviously, they had a very close relationship. He actually taught later, and he was part of the faculty at National College. So I don't think they were doing it, they were doing it as an instinct. They were doing it, and eventually, today, those colleges have a Sindhi quota. But the story is that it wasn't like that to start with. There was no such thing as a Sindhi quota. And then at some point, people started saying, hey, we built these colleges when we had nothing. Why aren't our children getting something out of it? So there was this gentleman called Nari Gurshahani, and he campaigned for it. He had to go to court. He fought for 20 years, and eventually he got it.
Now I'd like to come to the really interesting part, is food and cuisine. Now, Dinyar, you started off with the raspberry drink and Adeshi Kashiji Wadia and the raspberry soda. Is Parsi cuisine truly just Parsi, or is it an amalgamation of different local cuisines, or does it have some kind of Iranian influence in it? So I want to know about specifically the Patrani machi, the Sasni machi, the Russian patties, the chicken facha and pulao dal and lagan custard.
Very good. I could speak for hours on food. It's interesting that you bring this up because yesterday I teach at a business school, and I pity the person who erased the board in my classroom yesterday because I began a course by talking about pav bhaji and vada pav, and trying to point out that look, it's very hard to describe anything as authentic, right? Think of vada pav, right? Vada pav is regarded as being quintessentially Maharashtrian, kind of son of the soil over here. But pav is a Portuguese word. Pav came from Portuguese. Vada, anything with potatoes, that wasn't Indian 400, 500 years ago, right? So, those of us who study history come to the realization that this idea of what is authentic doesn't really exist. Politicians love to talk about this is authentically Maharashtrian, this is authentically Indian, this is part of Indian culture, whatever. As a historian, we tend to kind of look at that and say, you can't really say something is authentic. And that's the same with Parsi food as well. In the sense that, Parsi food has evolved over time. Things that people were eating 300 years ago is very different from what they're eating now. And it's evolved in a manner that has taken into account the different global connections between the community. So yes, we have certain things like Russian patties. We have all these dishes that are made out of white sauce. I hate white sauce. I don't know what, I tell my wife about this all the time. Why are people eating white sauce in India? You have such fantastic food. You're eating this stuff from the colonial era. But for better or worse, that was an influence from British cuisine that has remained within the community. As to whether the cuisine of Parsis was really Iranian or not, it really depends on what aspect of the cuisine you're talking about. I think the greatest roots of Parsi cuisine are from Gujarati, from Gujarat. From the non-vegetarian, especially non-vegetarian tradition of Gujarati food, and there is such a tradition. We have things like undiyo, we have umbariyo, which is a non-veg version of that. But when Iranian migrants came Zoroastrian Iranian migrants came from the 1800s. This is perhaps the greatest link that we have between Sindhis and Parsis in the sense that there was an element of refugee movement to Bombay. Zoroastrians who came from Iran who are Iranis, and the stories that they have of moving from Iran are as horrific and as dramatic as the stories that Saaz has talked about. They brought an Iranian influence. So, if you go and eat at Britannia, of course, you have your berry palau and you have the zeresh berry. I know that came from Iran. We don't grow zeresh over here. That comes from Iran and it was brought over. So there were certain elements that were brought in that have stayed on. Some elements, of Parsi cuisine have changed over time. Again, sodas. Soda was, of course, not a staple in Parsi cuisine or any cuisine 150 years ago, but it's become a part of Parsi cuisine since then. And I talked with the owner of one of these, I think Palanjis, before the lockdown, and he was telling me that, look, Parsi community obviously is not, terribly large in size. There's a diminishing customer base over there, but increasingly you have people who are not Parsis who are liking these drinks. They're retro, they're cool, and he's finding an expanding market not just in India, but abroad. Restaurants like Yishun, for example, which are marketing to a wide cosmopolitan audience. So as the community diversifies and kind of gets more global, you'll see more global inputs, I think, in the cuisine as well. Maybe at one point in time also we will stop eating white sauce. I'll hope for that.
Saaz, what about you? What about the Sindhi dishes? Because I mean, I know that what kind of food do you all eat at your functions?
I think in most Sindhi functions, there's a lot of international cuisine. I think Sindhis like to eat Sindhi food at home, but they always like to have something which has a touch of glamour and a touch of something different. They have experimental. I mean, they like to experiment with their food and they like to feel that they're eating something special. I know there are lots of Sindhis here. So, is there anyone who doesn't agree with me? Because, like I said, I'm not even a real Sindhi. I'm speaking on behalf of, is there anyone who doesn't agree with this? I think it's true. I believe it's true. So, when it comes to Sindhi food, one of the very interesting, I guess you all know what sial dabroti is, sial mani. We also have something called sial macaroni, which is actually macaroni. Now, where did that come from? I don't know actually whether it came from Karachi, the British, or whether the Sindhis brought it home, but it is definitely a part of Sindhi cuisine. There's a fish that is very popular with the Sindhis, that's the palla fish, which used to be something from Sindh. You don't really get it in Bombay, it's the river fish, it's a fish that swims upstream. It's the same as what the Bengalis eat, it's the musa. Apparently, there's also another fish which is called Sindhi machi. I don't know what it is, but it's been kind of appropriated as given the nationality of the Sindhis. That's also something we get in Sindh. A lot of Sindhis, in Sindh, almost everybody ate meat and fish. But now, I don't know whether it's a global trend or whether that's something to do with becoming very, very Hindu. A lot of people have stopped eating meat, including me, including my mom's brother who's sitting right here. We all used to be big carnivores. But yeah.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left, so we'll take a few questions, maybe 2 or 3.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sharon Irani. So as you can guess by the last name, my grandparents came over in the 20s actually from Iran. And regarding the Iranian cuisine, I actually wanted to ask Dinyar, can you explain the significance of Idu and Parsis? Like why? Because my grandmother used to pour raw egg down my throat every morning because it was supposedly healthy, and Parsis can't get enough of eating eggs on everything, including okra and keema and everything. So why?
That's actually a great question. I really do not know where that comes from. I mean, that'd be a great thing to investigate, to do a paper about. But it obviously is, it's a really important component of our cuisine, Irani, Parsi, whatever. There is obviously a certain habit for eating eggs in parts of Gujarati culture as well. All you have to do is go to Baroda and see these egg stalls. And I remember talking to people in Ahmedabad and would say, I'm a vegetarian, but we go on at night to eat eggs and stuff. So, I'm sure there's a strain of... Exactly, it's controversial. It's politically risky thing to talk about. But I honestly don't know. It's been there for a long time. It's a topic of pressing political importance. The reasons for why Parsis like eggs so much, and I honestly don't really have a proper answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So hi, my name is Viji Venkatesh. I have one question. How much truth is there in the story about that spoonful of sugar being mixed in a tumbler full of milk? Outside the door, I almost said, hey, I'm like that spoonful of sugar, let me in.
That's probably apocryphal. I mean, there are lots of stories that have circulated about the time that Parsis arrived. And, the classic account is, of course, the Kisi Sanjan, which I don't think mentions that. I think of the sugar being sent into milk. There were numerous oral accounts of the Parsi migration, which probably used metaphors like that. And we can see metaphors like this as a staple of literature across India. As to the truth and veracity of that, God knows. I mean, that story has Parsis interacting with a local king called Jadirana. We have no records of a king called Jadirana. So, God knows how much of it is true or not.
Hi, Dr. Patel. Actually, my question kind of segues from hers. Which is basically if you could shed some light into what life was like when Parsis first immigrated to Sanjan, and then eventually how that immigration, of course, we understand it was trade, but then moving your families to then what we see today, which is these large, big, flourishing bags across the 7 islands. So if you could just shed some light on that timeline.
So, if you're asking about what life was like for Parsis when Parsis first arrived in India.
Correct. To when they came to then Bombay into this flourishing community that we see, much like, when we understand Sindhis coming to Kalyan, etc.
Yeah. So in regards to things like Sanjan, we just don't know. We don't have sources. We have no clue really what life was like in those very early centuries. At best, we have evidence of things like duck marks. That's all we have really, to a large degree. Once Parsis started, I'll briefly mention, at least in Gujarat, oftentimes Parsis would settle in particular areas what are called Parsi Wads, and still go, to towns in Gujarat and see these old Parsi Wads, which was typical in the sense that communities would kind of self-segregate, and that happened in Bombay as well. Parsis would live in particular parts of Bombay. They live in a part of Fort. I think the northern part of Fort, Parsi Bazaar, eventually they moved to places like Paikala. The rich people would go to places like Malabar Hill eventually by the midpoint of the 1800s. So there was a degree of segregation. That cosmopolitan flavor, say Parsis or Sindhis or Muslims or Hindus or whoever are kind of living together, probably dates more from around the 1920s or so, when there were kind of cosmopolitan societies that were built. Marine Drive is a great example. The buildings that were built were, they might have been funded by a Parsi or Gujarati or a Sindhi, but they weren't exclusively meant for those people. So there was a degree of segregation. The bags only came up a little bit later. From the 1880s onward, we see first attempts at community housing and things like Kushro Bagh are built, in the 1920s or so. So they're relatively recent. They're not the same.
So my grandmom tells me this one story, that there was a Sindhi man in Italy and he got macaronis home. And that's how his wife cooked macaronis, because she did not know how to cook the Italian macaroni, and that's how the whole style macaroni.
You solved a big mystery for us. Now we know where it came from.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah.
I'm going to put this down in my next note, that that's what happened.
Yeah, and there's a second part to my question. So it's around that, if there's any advice that you have for us, like the Sindhis and the Parsis both, like if there's something that we could do right now to continue the tradition, the culture, and also the language. So this is something which could be like an everyday stuff.
It's easy to learn the language. There are a lot of online apps and stuff that you can download, and you can do it, and you probably should listen to scale set plays and just keep listening and read. I think there's lots of stuff coming out now. It's a long time. Last 70 years, not much was being talked about, but this is the time. So just go for it. Wonderful. There's this thing called Doorway to Sindh. Started by the Sindhi Culture Foundation, which is in Bangalore. So they do fabulous. Aruna Badnani, she's interviewed people. She's putting it out every week, and they are really excellent. Just Google it. I'm starting a podcast soon, so you will hear that as well. There's lots of stuff out there. Yeah.
I'm excited.
Unfortunately, we just have to wind up. Our time is up. But anyone who has a question for our panelists today can ask them personally. They're here for another 5 minutes, I guess, before they lock up the bar hall. Thank you all so much for being here and patiently sitting through the entire program. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sifra, Dinyar, Saaz, for a wonderful conversation. I think this diaspora is the most popular, judging by the numbers we have here. We're over 250 people in this room. I do apologize, and thanks, guys, for sitting on the floor. And thank you for being here. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you to all our partners, the Mumbai Research Center, Asiatic Society, Gateway House. I was also told to remind you to come to Jashan next weekend and the weekend after. And with Avid, we have many other programs planned. We're part of this Street Urban Arts Festival and Kalagora. So you'll see many, many more emailers spamming you for the month of February. So do show up in big numbers there. Thank you very much and have a good night.